Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hey listeners, it's Lindsay Smith Rogers. Today, e-bikes and e-scooters. Whether you love them or despise them, they're becoming ubiquitous in cities. Road safety expert and Johns Hopkins professor Johnathon Ehsani joins me to talk about their utility, their risks, what parents should consider, and whether or not cities should be embracing them. Thank you to listener Jana, who sent in this topic idea for us to explore. Let's listen. Johnathon Ehsani, welcome back to Public Health on Call. You are quickly becoming our on-call expert for road safety. We are delighted to have you back again. How are you?
Wonderful. Thank you, Lindsay. It's a pleasure to be here.
So today we are talking specifically about e-bikes and e-scooters, and we're going to get into their safety and what we know about them. But to start us off, would you just explain what these things are?
Sure. E-bikes are an interesting type of bicycle. Basically, they're bicycles with a little motor. And it's useful to know that there are differences in the power that these motors have. And so what you might see out there on the street could be simply a pedal-assisted e-bike where you kind of have to ride in order for it to go. And then you've got a next class, which is pedal-assisted, but it's got a little throttle, kind of like you could kind of boost your power. And the throttle and the speed of that throttle depends on that size of that motor that it's got. And so these break out into different classes, which we don't need to worry about. But basically, you can think of e-bikes as being pedal assist or pedal assist with throttle. And then the ones with throttle obviously go up to very high speeds. E-scooters are basically stand-up scooters with an electric motor in them with a throttle. And so there's no pedaling involved. You just stand and you press the throttle and you go. And I think anyone who's lived in a city or visited a city almost anywhere in the world has probably seen these or had to avoid one of these while walking on the sidewalk, because often they're where pedestrians are, which is one of the reasons why they're a polarizing issue. Often people either love them or hate them, depending on where you sit on the issue.
And so who is using these, and what are some of the maybe advantages of these modes of transportation?
In our survey research, we see that the population of people using these skew towards younger ages, although we do see people middle-aged and even older, sometimes more than one person on these devices. But generally speaking, for scooters, e-scooters in particular, we see they tend to skew towards younger ages. They tend to skew a little bit more towards males as well. But I would say among e-bike users, the population distribution is actually far more distributed. You see many people using e-bikes as a kind of a new way of getting around. Sometimes, the typical sight is a parent riding on the front with a kid or two in the back. We see older adults even using them to run their errands. And so it's interesting, they're a new addition to the transportation system, which is exciting from a public health perspective for two reasons. One is that there are people out there being physically active. Okay, we like that. That's a good thing. They're also better than driving, frankly, in terms of emissions. Okay, so there are two public health wins right there. Now, the downside is that we never really built our transportation system to accommodate these kinds of vehicles. And so when you're now introducing them into the existing transportation system without accommodating them and protecting the users, we run into some injury risks.
Before we get into those risks, I just want to ask you, how are these intended to be used? Are they intended to be used on like sidewalks where pedestrians are? Are they intended to be used in the street? Or have we not really worked that out yet?
Well, intended is a good question. I suppose that kind of comes down to where, your personal preferences might be. Do I feel safer on the sidewalk? Generally, I do. Do I feel safer on the street, driving alongside high-speed vehicles without any protection? I personally don't feel safe there. Would I feel safe if I was driving or riding on the street with a protected barrier between me and the cars? Yeah, I'd feel safe there. So the intention, I think, is wrapped around kind of the available infrastructure. Then layer on top of that is legislation. Actually, there are rules that cities have about where you can and can't ride these things. And so I think we have to kind of think about the ideal environment, which is probably a protected lane for these vehicles alongside bicycles and other kind of motor vehicle transportation. And then the reality, which is often it's a giant mess. If anyone's been to downtown Baltimore or downtown Washington, D.C., you're walking down the sidewalk and, e-bike and e-scooters are often kind of zigzagging in and out of traffic onto the sidewalk when they need to, and then back onto the road when they need to. And, that's partly a function of perhaps the environment that they're in. They don't have dedicated space to move around.
So let's get into some of these risks. We've gotten some listener questions about, people are hearing about high-profile accidents and things like that, particularly with e-bikes. But what do we know from an epidemiology standpoint about the risks and the injuries?
Yeah, the rate of increase in injuries from e-bikes and e-scooters is staggering. It vastly outpaces anything the traditional bikes or scooters ever did. And when people get hurt on these electric vehicles, basically electric bikes or e-scooters, the injuries tend to be more severe. And it doesn't take, a rocket scientist to figure out why. Injury is basically a function of the body's ability to tolerate a force, right? And that force is a function of your speed. So if you've got an electric motor powering you really fast, up to sometimes 30 miles per hour, and you go flying off that vehicle, well, then the injuries are going to be much more severe. And so the profile of injuries for these types of vehicles looks far more severe than what we saw with traditional bikes and scooters that did not have a motor powering them.
So are the injuries for one more concerning than the other? We're talking about bikes versus scooters because of that velocity?
Great question. So e-bikes and e-scooters have very different, if you like, injury profiles. You can think of it this way. Most people fall off an e-scooter either onto the sidewalk or in the roadway, okay? And so the overwhelming majority of e-scooter injuries are fall-related, something close to 80% of them. Now, e-bike injuries often involve crashing into something else. So rather than falling off and maybe scraping your knee or something far more severe, with e-bikes, you're crashing into something. And the severity of the injury really also relates to how much protection you're wearing. If you're wearing a helmet, then the injury risks are far lower. But in raw volume, basically, I think e-bikes are associated with more injuries than e-scooters. But let me just offer a caveat here, Lindsay, which is that what we don't know really matters here. While these numbers might be reflective of the real risks, it's the exposure on these devices, which is the big kind of X factor in all of the research in this space. So we still can't fully separate riskier device from how much riding is taking place. If a lot more people are riding on e-bikes, then it stands to reason that more injuries are going to happen just because there's more users. And so the big gap in our field right now, and something that many people are trying to figure out, is how much riding is actually happening on these. And with that, we can get closer to quantifying this very good question that you posed, which is, which one is riskier?
Yeah, I think that's the question that a lot of people are asking is are these things somehow inherently dangerous? And it sounds like it's a pretty complicated mix of the infrastructure isn't quite there yet. We don't actually know how much these things are being used. And so when we hear about these crashes and injuries, we don't know if that's the tip of the iceberg or if it's just a small population. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, yeah, I think the emergency admissions data suggests that the nature of the injuries is more devastating. Okay, so you are getting, when people get hurt on these, they're getting far more severely injured. Okay, more head injuries, more internal injuries, more ICU visits, and that's what these hospital data are showing. But when you think about how dangerous they are relative to other things or where we are before, that's where there's some gaps in our knowledge.
And so what should people know about these? I think there's kind of two conversations here. There's an adult user conversation, and then there's sort of a kids and youth conversation. So let's start with the kids and youth conversation, because I think that one's maybe a little bit more nuanced.
Yeah. So with the kids, I guess, one question you might be asking yourself as a parent is, should I get one for my kid? If the holidays coming up, should I buy an e-bike for my child? Well, the answer might be, well, it depends on their age. I think a 10-year-old on an e-bike is different to a 16-year-old on an e-bike. Younger kids on e-bikes tend to have higher concussion rates than any other age group. And teens are the ones riding in kind of more dangerous environments on the roads and so on. And so whatever you do, be aware of the top speed that the vehicle can go. Be aware that the vehicles can be easily modified with a quick YouTube search on how to kind of increase their maximum speed. So keep an eye on that. And then look at the kind of experience that your child has with a regular bicycle. Are they experienced with a regular bicycle? Where are they going to be using an e-bike or an e-scooter? And then make sure that they have an appropriate helmet. Now, this is important because the type of helmet you ride on with when you're on a regular bicycle is different to the type of helmet you have when you're on an electric bicycle or electric scooter. And so you want a kind of a type of helmet that is called an NTA 8776, which is, it's rated for the speeds that these devices tend to go. So they tend to cover more of the head, they're made of a different material, and they keep kids' heads safer.
And so now let's talk about the adult population. People might be around town and they just want to jump on an e-scooter just to get from A to B rather than using an Uber or something like that. They may not have a helmet with them. So how can they approach those situations?
Well, for adults, I think, the situation you just described is very typical. People are tending to use these e-scooters for convenience. They're fairly inexpensive. They're efficient. They can be pretty much parked anywhere. And I can relate to the experience of having to get from A to B and you don't have your helmet. In that case, I would say ride in the safest possible area you can without breaking the local laws. You might not know what they are, especially if you're coming from out of town. Try to avoid weaving in and out of traffic. And many of the shared e-scooters, for example, have a capped maximum speed. And that's there for a reason. It's there to keep the rider safe. And so if you are riding these, if you're in an environment that, I would say from an injury epidemiology perspective, everyone crashes more regardless of their mode on a road or an environment they've never ridden in. So why is that? Because you're kind of unfamiliar with where the risks are. If you're a regular user on a regular strip of road, you know where to watch out for the blind spot, where the incoming vehicles are in the traffic and so on. But if you're riding in a city you've never ridden before, on a route you've never ridden before, really, take the time, don't rush, and get there on the safest pathway that you can.
So last question for you. This might be more of a philosophical question, but we recently had you on and we were talking about autonomous vehicles, and where you kind of left the conversation was, should cities be embracing these? Should people be welcoming them? And I want to pose that same question here. Should we be putting more into e-bikes and e-scooters?
Lindsay, I love this question because actually I think it speaks to a number of different levels of ways cities can approach these. So I'll give you a really interesting case study actually that comes from another country in the UK, where e-bikes and e-scooters are really heavily regulated. And in fact, in the UK, you can't use a privately owned e-scooter. They're all shared e-scooters, okay? It's an interesting approach. Why is that a powerful approach from a public health perspective? Well, when everything is shared, you can actually use common policy approaches that you might use even with autonomous vehicles. Let me give you an example. In Baltimore's a very busy harbor, downtown harbor area, the top speed of e-scooters that are rented is capped at 5 miles per hour. That's because the scooters are going through heavily trafficked pedestrian areas, and you don't want a high-speed scooter hitting a pedestrian, right? The beauty of what cities can do when you have an entirely shared scooter fleet is that you can geofence and cap maximum speeds where the highest risk areas are. It's a really exciting idea that you could cap the speed and perhaps the injury risk of an entire population of users. You could also geofence them so that they won't work on highways, for example, or they won't work on other high-risk roadways, or potentially on the sidewalk, but they might work on roads. And so I think for cities, you also have to be mindful, because they are a polarizing topic. You have to be mindful of how people are using them, how they're parking them. One of the biggest complaints I have of these devices is that people very thoughtlessly kind of park them after they're used right in the middle of the sidewalk. If you're a parent pushing a stroller, if you're someone in a mobility assisted device like a wheelchair or an electrified scooter, then you're basically stuck and you have to either kind of come off or come onto the roadway and so on. How people finish using these scooters and e-bikes is just as important as how they're actually using them. So I'd say that cities who are considering these have a kind of a whole toolkit of ways they can introduce them in a way that might be really good in terms of a win for mobility for their cities, but they could also implement them in a way that might be a win for safety as well by using some of the tools that I just described.
Well, this has been a great conversation. We always love hearing from you. Thank you so much for being on Public Health on Call.
My pleasure. Thank you, Lindsay.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith Rogers, Stephanie Desmond, and Rachel Walsh. Audio production by Michael Bonfils, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from J.B. Arbogast, Spencer Greer, and Chip Hickey. Distribution and social media by Rachel Walsh, with support from Nick Moran and Brianna Iacovelli. Follow us on Instagram and Blue Sky at Public Health Pod for more public health takes and special content. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.